She spent 8 months planning the night that was supposed to save her marriage. Instead, it became the night she buried it and walked straight into the arms of the most dangerous man in Chicago. If you've ever loved someone who treated your love like a burden, stay until the end of this story. It won't just shock you, it will remind you what you're worth. Drop a like and comment the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The invitation said 7 o'clock. Naomi Brooks arrived at 6:15 because she always arrived early to everything. Not out of nervousness, not out of eagerness, but because she was the one who built the thing. The Crystal Monarch Hotel's grand ballroom had been her project for the better part of 8 months. She knew every centerpiece by its SKU number. She'd personally approved the color temperature of each overhead chandelier. She'd tasted the salmon 3 times across 2 different vendors before committing. When the floral coordinator had a breakdown in week 6 over peony availability, it was Naomi who drove to 3 separate suppliers on a Tuesday afternoon, wearing a blazer and flat shoes and talking calmly into her earpiece, fixing what other people called unfixable. She did that a lot, fix things, quietly, without credit. The ballroom looked extraordinary. She stood at the entrance arch and let herself take it in for exactly 45 seconds. The only moment she'd allow herself something like pride before the guests arrived and the night swallowed her into its machinery. Crystal columns, deep navy linens with gold-edge stitching, 200 place settings, each one positioned to a centimeter, a quartet warming up near the east window, playing something instrumental and low, the sound moving through the room like smoke. She looked beautiful, and she knew it. The gown was emerald, full length, with a structured bodice that her seamstress had spent 3 weeks perfecting. It didn't try to minimize her. It wasn't built around apology. It was built around her shoulders, her arms, the fullness of her figure. And it held her the way a frame holds something worth framing. 10 years. That was what tonight was supposed to celebrate. She reached into her clutch and touched the wedding band on her left hand. Platinum. Simple. Elliot had picked it out himself, back when he still did things like that. Back when he still looked at her the way she'd spent the last 2 years trying to convince herself he still looked at her. The catering supervisor appeared at her elbow. "Mrs. Brooks, everything's on schedule." "The wine service, make sure the white is at temperature." "Last time, already handled." He smiled carefully. "You thought of everything." She nodded and let him go. She had thought of everything. That was the problem. She always thought of everything. And Elliot never had to think at all because she was already thinking. She wondered sometimes, not tonight, she told herself, not tonight, whether that was love or whether it was something more like maintenance, whether she had spent 10 years being a wife or being a system that kept a man functional. She pushed it down. She was good at that too. Guests began arriving at 6:50. Chicago's upper tier, commercial developers, hospitality executives, a city councilman whose name kept appearing in newspapers for reasons that were never quite flattering but never quite prosecutable. The Korean business contingent arrived in a cluster, sharp-dressed, minimal in gesture. She greeted each one by name. She knew their spouses' names. She knew which ones preferred red wine and which ones found American small talk exhausting and wanted to talk directly about substance. They responded to her with a warmth she'd stopped noticing she was receiving. It had become normal. People being glad to see her, people relaxing in her presence, people seeking her out in the corner of a room to have the real conversation instead of the performed one. Elliot was not there yet. She checked her phone at 7:03. Nothing. At 7:11 she texted, "Running behind?" At 7:19 he replied, "On my way." She returned the phone to her clutch and smiled at the wife of a shipping magnate who was telling her something about their daughter's university decision. She listened. She asked a follow-up question. She did not look at the door. He walked in at 7:34. She knew before she turned around. Something in the air changed. Not dramatically, not cinematically, just a subtle pressure shift the way a room feels different when a window opens somewhere. She turned and she saw him, and then she saw the woman beside him, and the rest of the room went very quiet in a way that had nothing to do with sound. The woman was not a colleague. Naomi understood that in the first half second. The woman, young, maybe 26, narrow through the hips, wearing a dress the color of champagne that had clearly been purchased recently and deliberately, was holding Elliot's arm. Not politely, Not the way you hold someone's arm at a business function. She was holding it the way you hold something that belongs to you. Elliot was not looking at Naomi. He was scanning the room with the expression he wore when he wanted people to see him first, when he wanted to control the angle of his own entrance. His jaw was set in that particular way. Relaxed but deliberate. A performance of ease. Then he found her. For 1 second, something moved across his face. She couldn't name it. It wasn't guilt, exactly. It was closer to the expression a person makes when they've been anticipating a moment so long that finally arriving in it feels anticlimactic. He walked toward her. The woman came with him. The room had not stopped. Not technically. People were still talking. Glasses were still moving. But there was a perimeter of quiet forming around Naomi. An awareness that the people nearest her had picked up on something and were waiting. Naomi. He stopped 3 feet from her. You look. He glanced at her dress, and something in his face shifted, a flicker of something she could not allow herself to interpret correctly in this moment. You went all out. It's our anniversary, she said. Her voice was even. She had trained herself over years to make her voice even when she needed it to be. 10 years. Right. He nodded. Then he stepped half to the side and said, This is Priya. The woman smiled. It was not a cruel smile. It was, in some ways, worse than a cruel smile. It was the smile of someone who had been assured this was going to go a certain way, and who was simply waiting for it to go that way. Priya is... Elliot paused, and in that pause, Naomi understood that he had rehearsed this, that he had thought about how to phrase it, and that whatever he said next was going to be the version he'd decided on after testing other versions in his head. She's important to me. The quiet around them had expanded. Naomi looked at him. She made herself look at him directly, made herself hold it, made herself read exactly what was on his face. Not cruelty, not rage, but something more corrosive than either of those things. Certainty. He was certain she would absorb this, certain she would steady herself and manage the room and find a way to make this bearable the way she made everything bearable. He was certain because she had always done exactly that. Elliot, her voice was still even. What are you doing? And that was when he looked out at the room, at the executives and the syndicate representatives and the politicians and the people whose business had been built partly on Naomi's handshake and Naomi's phone calls and Naomi's willingness to be in a room at 6:15 making sure every centerpiece was placed correctly. And he said loudly enough to be heard by the people nearest them, I've been meaning to say this for a while. I need a woman who fits the image. Who can stand next to me in a room like this and... Elliot, she said his name again, quieter this time, a warning. He didn't stop. You're a good person, Naomi, but successful men... He gestured vaguely at the room, at himself, the gesture encompassing all of it, his tailored suit, his property portfolio, his name on the side of a building on Wacker Drive. Successful men need a partner who looks like her. Naomi said it for him, flatly, not a question. He didn't deny it. The room was very still now. The quartet had stopped playing. She didn't know when that had happened. She stood in her emerald gown, in the ballroom she had spent 8 months building, in front of 200 people she had welcomed by name, and she felt the humiliation rise in her like a tide. She felt it in her chest, in her throat, behind her eyes. She felt it the way you feel water pressure when you're underwater and you've gone too deep, and your body tells you in every register it has that you need to surface. She did not surface. She went deeper. Her right hand moved to her left hand and she removed the ring, slowly. The way you remove something you've been wearing so long, you sometimes forget it's there. She held it for a moment, feeling the weight of it, the surprising weight of a thing so small. Then she placed it, without theater, on the nearest table, on the white linen, between a water glass and a bread plate. She did not look at Elliot. She looked out across the ballroom. There were 200 people in this room. She knew most of them. She had earned the trust of most of them through years of being exactly what she was. Competent, honest, the person who actually delivered, the person you called when something was going wrong and you needed it going right, without anyone knowing there'd ever been a problem. She scanned the room and her eyes moved, deliberately or instinctively she couldn't have said, toward the far corner. He was already watching her. Kang Tae-jun stood apart from his group, as he always stood apart, as though the concept of a group had simply never quite applied to him. He was 61 years old, and he looked like a man who had spent 61 years accumulating weight, not physical weight, though he was solid, though he carried himself in the particular way of someone who understood that physical presence was its own form of language, but the other kind. The kind that came from having made decisions that other men couldn't make, and living with those decisions long enough that they stopped feeling like decisions and started feeling like facts. He was Elliot's uncle by blood, though Naomi had understood for years that the relationship was more complicated than that word implied. Elliot's mother was Tae-jun's younger sister, and Elliot had spent his adult life performing proximity to the Kang Empire without ever being trusted with anything real inside it. Tae-jun had built that empire from nothing, from a shipping operation in Busan in the late 80s that everyone in the Korean underworld agreed you did not want to cross, through a decade of expansion into Southeast Asian distribution networks, and then the pivot in the early 2000s into legitimate investment in property, the kind of transformation that required not just money, but a particular type of intelligence, the ability to read which way the world was turning before the turn happened. He'd moved the center of operations to Chicago 12 years ago. Nobody in Chicago's corporate world talked about Kang Tae-jun at dinner parties. His name came up in certain specific context, due diligence meetings that ran long, background checks that came back with information that made lawyers uncomfortable, introductions that happened and were then never quite acknowledged. He was present in the city's financial architecture the way load-bearing walls were present in a building, invisible unless you looked for them, structural once you understood what you were looking at. Naomi had met him 4 times over the course of her marriage to Elliot. Each time he had observed her with an attention that was so quiet and so complete that it made most people nervous. She had never been nervous. She had always had the instinct that he was watching the same way she watched, not to evaluate threat level, but to understand what was actually happening beneath the surface of what appeared to be happening. She had respected that. She suspected, without any concrete basis, that he had respected it back. Now she walked toward him. She was aware of the room watching. She felt it on the back of her neck, the collective attention of 200 people tracking the direction of her movement, understanding with animal social instinct that something significant was occurring. She walked at a normal pace. She didn't hurry. She crossed the ballroom floor in her emerald gown with the quiet, direct purpose of someone who had decided the next thing she was going to do and was doing it. She stopped in front of him. He was taller than she remembered, or she was more aware of it now, the way you became aware of things when you were paying attention to only one thing. "Mr. Kang," she said. He said nothing. He waited. He was very good at waiting in a way that communicated that he had all the time available to him and was choosing how to spend it. "I have a proposal," she said, "and I'd ask you to hear it before you respond." Something moved in his eyes. Not surprise. She had the impression that this man had encountered very few surprises in the last 20 years, but something adjacent to it. Attention, sharpening. "I'm listening," he said. His English was precise, slightly formal. The English of someone who had learned it as an adult and approached it with the same rigor they brought to everything. She looked at him directly. "Marry me." The silence between them was complete. Around them, at the outer edge of their invisible perimeter, she heard a breath catch, heard the tiny adjustments people made when they were trying to watch something without appearing to watch something, heard the microscopic cessation of ambient sound. Tae-jun's face did not move. He held her gaze the way he held everything, with complete stillness, as though the world was a problem he was accustomed to solving by waiting for it to reveal itself fully before he acted. She continued because she had said she had a proposal, and a proposal required more than a single sentence. "Your nephew used tonight to end our marriage publicly. He did it deliberately, in front of everyone who matters to both of you in this city. Whatever the fallout is from that, business, social, within your family structure, I'm the one positioned at the center of it." She paused. "I also know things about Elliot's business operations that I haven't done anything with yet, because I wasn't sure what to do with them. I'm sure now." He listened. He did not move. "I'm not asking for protection," she said. "I'm not asking for rescue. I'm asking for a partnership, a real one. I know what I bring to a room. I know what I've been building for 10 years while your nephew attached his name to my work." She let that land. "You've watched me operate. You know I'm not wrong about that." The silence extended another 3 seconds. Then Kang Tae-jun straightened. He'd been still so long that the movement seemed to arrive from somewhere internal, a decision surfacing. And he said, in a voice quiet enough that only she could hear it, "Let's leave." She nodded once. He offered his arm. She took it. They walked toward the exit together, and behind them, the ballroom moved and whispered and reconstructed itself around the fact of what it had just witnessed, the way a body of water moves after something large has passed through it. From across the room, she heard Elliot laugh. It was the kind of laugh that came from relief, the relief of someone who believed they had just won something and hadn't yet registered the full dimensions of what they'd walked away from. She didn't look back. The night air hit her as they stepped out of the Crystal Monarch's front entrance, and she breathed it in. November in Chicago, the cold sharp enough to be honest, the wind coming off the lake with no interest in being gentle. A black car was already at the curb. Of course there was. A man like Tae-jun did not wait for cars. She sat in the back beside him. The door closed. The city moved past the window. He didn't speak for a long moment. When he did, it was without preamble, without the social scaffolding most people use to approach a difficult subject. "What do you know about his operations?" She looked at him. "Enough. Be specific." 3 shell companies, Bermuda registration. The money moves through them on a cycle, roughly 90 days, and comes out attributed to real estate development projects that exist on paper, but not in any form that withstands scrutiny. The last one was a $42 million building in Evanston that broke ground 6 months ago. The concrete contract went to a company that has the same registered agent as 2 of the shells. He was quiet. "I found it by accident," she said. 18 months ago. I was helping a city council liaison with documentation for a zoning approval, and I was cross-referencing some subsidiary filings, and I saw the name twice where it should have appeared once." She looked out the window. "I didn't do anything with it because—" She stopped. "Because you were still trying to save the marriage," he said. Not a question. She looked back at him. "Yes." He nodded slowly, the kind of nod that absorbed information without performing a reaction to it. "The woman he brought tonight," she said. "Priya. She's not just a girlfriend. I think she's been used in some of the transactions. I don't know how much she knows." The car turned south. The lake appeared between buildings and then was gone again. "This is more than a personal matter," Tae-jun said. "I know. If what you're describing is accurate—" He paused. "It touches the Kang family's legitimate holdings. Elliot runs several partnerships that are adjacent to our investment structures. Any investigation that reaches him will probe those adjacencies." "Yes," she said. "I know that too." He turned and looked at her fully, the first time since they'd been in the car. His gaze was the kind that felt like a question being formulated, not about her honesty, but about something more complicated, about the architecture of the situation, about what it meant that she was sitting here and had chosen this rather than any of the other available options. "Why come to me?" he said. "You could have gone to prosecutors, quietly." "Because quiet doesn't do anything to protect me," she said. "And because Elliot doesn't stop at business." "He doesn't." She let that sit for a moment, let him read what she wasn't saying out loud. "I needed someone who understands that a problem that's allowed to grow becomes a different class of problem." He held her gaze for another moment, then he turned back to the window. "There are conditions," he said. "Name them. You work with me directly, not through intermediaries. Whatever you know, you bring to me first." "Agreed." "The marriage is real in every public context. I don't do theater." She paused on that. It was the kind of pause that was itself an answer, a moment of reckoning, of measuring what she was agreeing to. "Understood," she said. "And understand this clearly, Mrs. Brooks." He caught himself. Corrected. "Naomi. If at any point I determine that you've withheld something material or that your judgment cannot be trusted, this arrangement ends on my terms." "I'd expect nothing less," she said. "The same applies in the reverse direction." He looked at her again. This time there was something almost imperceptible in his expression. Not warmth, not yet, but the precursor to it. The moment when a person recognizes that the person across from them is not performing, that the person across from them is actually here, actually present, actually meaning exactly what they're saying. "Fair," he said. The car moved through the city. She looked out the window at Chicago passing, at the lit towers and the dark water and the infrastructure of a place that ran on money and relationship and the invisible architecture of who owed whom and who had been in the room when decisions got made. She had been in those rooms. She had always been in those rooms. She had just never been there under her own name. That was going to change. She didn't feel triumphant. She didn't feel the particular clarity that movies assign to moments of transformation. She felt the weight of what had just happened. The ring on the table, Elliot's face, the cold air, the car, this man. And underneath the weight was something else. Something she didn't have a clean word for. Not courage. Something more functional than courage. The feeling of having moved through a wall she'd been standing in front of for a long time and discovering that her legs still worked on the other side. Her phone buzzed in her clutch. She looked at it. Elliot. 17 missed calls starting at 8:04. She turned the phone face down on her knee. Taejun glanced at it without appearing to glance at it. "He'll be at my office by morning," he said. "He'll want to frame tonight as a family matter." "It's not a family matter anymore," she said. "No," he agreed. "It isn't." The car slowed toward a building she recognized, Taejun's primary residence in the Gold Coast, a converted 19th century building with a modern structural addition that somehow managed to look like it had always been there. She'd been told about it, but had never been inside. As the car stopped, Taejun spoke again, and his voice had shifted by a register. Not softer exactly, but more direct in the way that came from having made a decision and now executing it. "There is something you should know before we go inside." She waited. "Elliot came to my office 3 weeks ago," he said. "He told me he was planning to end the marriage. He asked me not to interfere." He paused. "He told me you would take it badly, that you might try to cause problems for him with our business contacts." She absorbed this. "He asked me to—" Taejun seemed to weigh the next word carefully. "Distance myself from you, in advance, so that when the announcement came, you would have no resources to draw on." The cold in the car was the cold of understanding something fully. She had known Elliot was not a good man. She had known it for some time in the part of herself she'd kept quiet. But there was a difference between knowing and knowing, between the version of a fact you managed and the version of a fact that arrived without insulation. He had not just been unfaithful. He had planned this. He had tried to isolate her. He had gone to the most powerful person in his orbit and asked them to cut her off before she could land. "What did you tell him?" she said. Taejun's expression was exactly the same as it had been throughout the entire conversation. Still, considered, revealing only what he chose to reveal. "I told him I would think about it. And then tonight, you watched to see what I would do," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. He looked back. And in that exchange, that mutual, unperformed acknowledgement of exactly what had just been said, something shifted in the nature of what they were doing together. It became less a transaction and more a recognition. Two people who operated below the surface of things, who had each been watching the other across years of proximity, finally looking directly. "He underestimated both of us," she said. "He usually does," Taejun said. He opened the car door. "Come inside." She stepped out into the November night. The Gold Coast was quiet this time of evening, the particular quiet of money that didn't need to announce itself. She stood on the sidewalk for just a moment, the wind coming through, and she thought about the ring she had left on the table, about what it had taken to leave it there, about what it meant that leaving it had felt, in some register she hadn't expected, like the first honest thing she'd done in years. She followed Taejun through the entrance. The lobby was minimal and dark-paneled, a single security desk with a man who nodded at Taejun without speaking. The elevator was wood-paneled, slow, the kind of elevator that conveyed the building's age and didn't apologize for it. She stood beside him as the floors passed. On the 4th floor, the elevator opened into a private hallway. Taejun led her to the right, past 2 doors, and then into a study. Bookshelves on 3 walls, a desk that faced the window, the city's north side visible in horizontal strips between the slats of half-drawn blinds. 2 chairs faced each other near the window. He gestured to one. She sat. He sat across from her. On the desk behind him, a phone was lit up. He glanced at it, then back at her. "His attorney," he said. "They're already moving." "Of course they are," she said. He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees, and she saw for the first time the precise quality of his tiredness. Not exhaustion, not the tiredness of someone overwhelmed, but the tiredness of someone who had been carrying something heavy for a long time and was accustomed to its weight. She recognized it. She had seen it in her own mirror. "Tell me everything you know about the Evanston project," he said. "Every detail. From the beginning." She folded her hands in her lap and began to speak. She talked for 40 minutes. He listened without interrupting, without writing anything down, with the focused attention of someone whose memory was his primary instrument. She told him about the registered agent, a law firm in Grand Cayman with a public record of appearing in 7 different shell structures she'd been able to trace. She told him about the concrete contractor, about the timing of the money movements, about the city council liaison who had unknowingly handed her the thread she needed to start pulling. She told him something she hadn't told anyone. 16 months ago, she had received an anonymous document drop, a manila envelope in her home mailbox with no return address, containing 6 pages of transaction records for one of the shell companies. Someone inside whatever Elliot was doing had wanted her to have that information. She had never been able to determine who. Taejun went very still when she said this. "You have the documents," he said. "They're in a safety deposit box at a bank downtown," she said. "Not the bank Elliot uses. Not one associated with either of our names. I opened it under my maiden name 18 months ago." He said nothing for a moment. Then, "He doesn't know you have them." "No. And you've told no one." "No one," she said. "Until right now." The room was very quiet. The city outside made its low, constant sound, traffic and wind, and the structural hum of a place that never fully stopped. Taejun looked at her for a long time, long enough that another person might have grown uncomfortable. She didn't grow uncomfortable. She let him look. She was being evaluated in a way that had nothing to do with the way Elliot had evaluated her, had nothing to do with the category of evaluation she'd spent her entire marriage inside, the evaluation that measured her against a particular narrow standard and found her wanting. This evaluation was different. This was the kind that happened when someone was trying to determine whether a thing was structurally sound, whether it would hold weight, whether it was the thing it appeared to be. "Naomi," he said. "Yes." "Why didn't you use this material to protect yourself? Why sit on it for 16 months? She thought about how to answer honestly. "Because I wasn't sure what I wanted," she said. "I knew what I had. I didn't know what I was willing to do with it. There's a difference between having a weapon and being willing to use one." She paused. "Tonight clarified that for me." He nodded once, slow, the way he seemed to do when something had resolved in his mind. "Tomorrow morning," he said, "before Elliot reaches my office, I want you to go to that bank." "I was already planning to," she said. Something moved across his face, brief, controlled, but present. "Yes," he said. "I imagine you were." Outside, the city continued its quiet machinery of consequence and motion. Inside, in this dark study, something was beginning. She could feel its edges without knowing its shape, the way you could feel weather before it arrived. Something that was not yet clear, something that had not yet declared what it intended to be. But somewhere across the city, in a ballroom she had built and a marriage she had tried to save, Elliot Brooks was laughing. He was laughing because he believed he had won. He had no idea that the woman he had publicly dismissed, the woman he had tried to preemptively isolate, the woman he had replaced in the center of his own curated life, that woman had spent the last hour telling the most dangerous man in Chicago every secret Elliot thought was safely buried. And the most dangerous man in Chicago had listened to every word. The safety deposit box had 6 pages. Naomi had never mentioned to anyone, not to the anonymous sender, not to the attorney she'd briefly consulted, and certainly not to Elliot, that she hadn't stopped at 6 pages. She had kept going. There were 31. Taejun's phone stopped lighting up sometime around 2 in the morning. Naomi noticed because she had been watching it peripherally for the last hour, not obviously, not in a way that would read as anxiety, but in the way she watched everything she wasn't supposed to be watching, with the lateral attention of someone who had learned early that the most important information in any room was usually arriving through the side door. When the calls stopped, it meant Elliot had either given up for the night or had reached someone who told him to stop calling. Neither option was good. She was in the guest room on the third floor of Tai Jun's Gold Coast building, a room that was spare and dark-paneled and smelled faintly of cedar, the kind of room that communicated that guests were welcome, and also that the house had its own center of gravity that had nothing to do with whether guests were comfortable. She had not slept. She had lain on top of the covers in her clothes, shoes off, staring at the ceiling and running through the evening sequence of events, the way you ran through a chess game after it was over, looking for the moves you should have seen coming. She should have seen Priya coming. She had seen something coming, had felt the particular quality of Elliot's distance over the last several months change texture, become less like a man who was pulling away and more like a man who was positioning. She had not let herself name it. She had called it stress and workload and the natural entropy of a long marriage that had stopped being tended. She had kept not naming it because naming it would have required her to decide what to do about it. And she had not been ready to decide. She was ready now. At 4:15, she heard movement on the floor below. Quiet, deliberate movement, the kind that came from someone who was awake and functioning and had been awake for some time. She sat up, put her shoes on, and went downstairs. Taijun was at the kitchen table with a cup of tea and a laptop, reading something that he angled slightly away from her as she entered. Not dramatically, just enough. She registered it without commenting. "You don't sleep much," she said. "I sleep when things are settled." He looked up. "Things are not settled." She sat down across from him. "What did you find?" He turned the laptop toward her. The screen showed a corporate registry document, one of the shell companies she had described, the Bermuda registration, with its listed directors and its listed registered agent. Beside it, on a split screen, was a second document she hadn't seen before. "The concrete contractor in Evanston," he said. "Its parent company. Follow the chain." She looked. Followed. Her eyes moved down through the chain of ownership. The contractor to its holding company, the holding company to a private equity vehicle, the private equity vehicle to... She stopped. "That's your name," she said. "A variation of it," he said. "Kang Capital Partners. A vehicle I haven't used actively since 2019. The registration was never dissolved." He paused. "Someone inserted a fraudulent amendment to the partnership agreement 14 months ago, added a new general partner designation." "Elliot?" she said. "His initials, through a nominee." He closed the laptop. "If this surfaces in a federal inquiry, the first name prosecutors see isn't Elliot's, it's mine." The kitchen was very quiet. The building made its old sounds, the tick of pipes, the low hum of the refrigerator, the city outside muffled by good windows and thick walls. "He built a fallback," she said. "If his operation collapsed, yes. He had a structure ready that pointed liability toward my organization." He picked up his tea, held it without drinking. "He came to my office 3 weeks ago to tell me about the divorce. He was not simply informing me. He was observing whether I had discovered this yet." She sat with that for a moment, with the full shape of it. Elliot had not just been running a financial scheme, he had been building an escape route out of it, and the escape route ran directly through his uncle's empire. If everything fell apart, Tae-jun took the weight. Elliot walked. "How long have you known?" she asked. "I found the amendment 3 days ago." He set the cup down. "I did not yet know about your documents. So we each had half of it." "Yes." She looked at the closed laptop. "He's more careful than I gave him credit for." "Don't make that mistake again," Tae-jun said. It wasn't a reprimand. It was the tone of someone sharing operational intelligence. She absorbed it. "What do we do with the documents?" "Not yet," he said. "If we move now, we show our hand before we know the full shape of his operation. There may be people connected to this we haven't identified." He looked at her steadily. "I need 48 hours. He won't wait 48 hours to make a move. No, he'll come to me first. He'll try to reframe this as a family issue, his marriage, his business choices, and he'll expect me to handle you quietly, remove you from the situation. And you'll let him think that's possible." "For approximately 24 hours, yes." She nodded slowly. There was something uncomfortable about this, about the deliberateness of it, about being the subject of a managed narrative, even temporarily. But she understood the logic, and she understood that discomfort was not a reason to reject good strategy. "I'll need to access the safety deposit box this morning," she said, "before his attorney moves to freeze any assets connected to my name." 7:30, he said. I'll have someone drive you. I don't need an escort. He looked at her. Naomi. Elliot made 17 calls last night, and at midnight, 3 of them went to a number registered to a private security firm based in Schaumburg. I don't know yet what he said. He paused. You'll have an escort. She held his gaze for a moment, then, fine. He almost smiled. It didn't quite arrive, but the structure of it was there around his eyes. I'll have coffee ready when you come back down. She went back upstairs and stood at the window in the dark guest room and looked out at the pre-dawn city. Chicago at 4:30 in the morning had a particular character. Not sleepy, not quiet, but suspended. A city briefly between its own thoughts. She had always loved this hour in a way she'd never fully explained to anyone, because the explanation sounded too much like loneliness, and she'd spent a long time not wanting to admit how much of her interior life she'd kept company only with herself. She thought about the ring on the table. She thought about the weight of it, leaving her hand. She thought, with a precision she hadn't allowed herself until now, about the full sequence of Elliot's calculation. The anonymous document drop in her mailbox, the 16 months of her sitting on information she hadn't used, the divorce announcement timed for maximum public humiliation, the preemptive call to Tae-jun asking him to distance himself. All of it designed to leave her with nothing, no leverage, no allies, no public standing to speak from. He had thought of everything. He had not thought of the 31 pages. And he had not thought of what she would do when she finally stopped trying to save something that had never been hers to save. At 7:25, she came downstairs in fresh clothes. She'd had enough presence of mind to pack a change in a bag before the anniversary dinner, an old habit from years of managing events that ran long and unpredictable. Tae-jun's driver was waiting in the lobby. She went to the bank on Michigan Avenue, signed in under her maiden name, sat in the small private room with the long fluorescent light, and opened the box. The documents were exactly where she'd left them. She removed all 31 pages, photographed each one with her phone, and placed the originals into a document envelope she'd brought. She also removed the secondary contents of the box, a USB drive, a notebook in her own handwriting covering 14 months of observations, and a second envelope she had sealed herself containing a letter she had written 11 months ago and addressed to the Cook County State's Attorney's Office. She had never sent it. She had written it as a contingency, a thing she would send only if there was no other option. There were other options now, but she kept the letter. She was back at Tae-jun's building at 8:50. Elliot arrived at 9:04. She heard him before she saw him. The particular cadence of his walk, which she had learned over 10 years the way you learn the sound of a specific door in a specific house, the way the human brain involuntarily mapped the people it lived closest to. Quick, slightly heavy, projecting confidence at a volume that had always been calibrated to fill a room and prevent anyone from talking first. She was in the study. The door was open. He stopped in the hallway when he saw her. His face went through 3 things in rapid succession: surprise, recalibration, and then something that locked into an expression she recognized: the careful blankness of a man deciding in real time what version of himself to perform. Naomi. He said her name the way you'd say it to a difficult client, neutrally, without affect. Elliot. She matched his tone. He looked down the hall toward the study where Tae-jun was presumably waiting. I need to talk to my uncle. He'll be with you in a minute, she said. I'm finishing something. He stared at her. You're finishing something. Yes. He walked toward her, stopped in the doorway. He was wearing yesterday's shirt under a fresh jacket. He'd gone home, she registered, but hadn't fully changed, which meant either the night had been more chaotic than he'd expected, or he was in more of a hurry than he wanted to appear. What exactly do you think is happening here? I think you made a business decision and a personal decision simultaneously last night, and you're now dealing with the consequences of both. She didn't look up from the document on the desk, one of Tae-jun's corporate charts she was reviewing at his request. I think you're also surprised I'm not at a hotel somewhere trying to reach my sister. You don't have anywhere to go, he said. The cruelty in it was casual, almost absent-minded. The cruelty of someone who had been saying things like this for so long they no longer registered the weight. She looked up then. I'm here, aren't I? He opened his mouth, closed it. Tae-jun appeared at the other end of the hallway. Elliot. Elliot turned. Uncle, I need to speak with you privately. Come in. Taejun gestured to the study. She stood, gathered the chart, and moved toward the door. Elliot stepped aside with the exaggerated courtesy of someone performing deference while radiating fury. She walked past him close enough to feel his breath change. Faster, tighter, the breathing of someone who had walked into a room expecting one configuration of power and found another. She went to the kitchen and sat at the table. She couldn't hear them clearly, but she could hear register and rhythm. Elliot's voice rising and flattening and rising again, Taejun's voice staying at a single level throughout, the particular tone of someone who had decided the conversation's outcome before it started. She heard her own name once. She heard the word evidence from Elliot, surprised, sharper than the surrounding syllables. She heard a silence that lasted almost a full minute. Then footsteps. Elliot came into the kitchen doorway. His face had changed. The careful blankness was gone. What was under it was not rage, not yet, but the state that preceded rage, the state where a person was realizing that the ground they were standing on was not ground. "What did you tell him?" he said. "The truth." "What truth?" He moved into the kitchen. "Naomi, what did you tell him?" "Sit down, Elliot. I'm not going to—" "Sit down." Her voice did not rise. It did not need to. There was a quality in it that had been accumulating over the course of the last 14 hours. Something that was the verbal equivalent of a wall. Not hostile, not aggressive, simply present in a way that communicated it was not going to move. He sat. She looked at him. She had loved this man. She had loved him badly, incompletely, with the partial, maintained love of someone who was always simultaneously loving and managing, always giving and budgeting, always present and slightly in reserve. But she had loved him. She needed to acknowledge that to herself before what came next, needed to hold it briefly and set it down. She set it down. 3 shell companies, she said, Bermuda registration. Kang Capital Partners used as a liability shield through a fraudulent partnership amendment. Priya Anand's name on 2 of the transaction intermediary accounts. 42 million through Evanston. She paused. And 31 pages of documentation. The color left his face, not gradually, all at once, the way a screen goes dark. "Where did you get—" "Someone wanted me to have them," she said. "I don't know who. I've had them for 16 months. He stared at her. She watched him process it, watched the sequence of responses move through him. Disbelief, then calculation, then something that looked almost like the beginning of fear. "You've had them for 16 months and you didn't—" "I was trying to save our marriage," she said. "That's done now." He put his hands flat on the table. She watched his jaw set, watched him find from somewhere the version of himself that defaulted to offense when defense was no longer viable. "You think you can just hand something like that to him and he protects you? You think he's doing this out of—" He stopped. "He's using you, Naomi. That's what he does. He finds people with things he needs, and he uses them, and when he's done—" "Elliot!" Taejun's voice from the doorway. Quiet, final. Elliot stopped. Taejun walked into the kitchen and stood at the counter. He didn't sit. He looked at his nephew with an expression she had not seen on him before. Not anger, not contempt, but something more elemental. The expression of someone who had extended trust across a long distance and was standing in the moment of understanding how thoroughly that trust had been betrayed. "You used my company's name," he said. Elliot said nothing. "You built a structure that would have pointed federal liability toward the Kang family, to protect yourself." His voice was still even. The evenness of it was worse than anger would have been. "You came to my office 3 weeks ago. You sat across from me. You asked me to manage your wife." He paused. "All while that structure was already in place. Uncle, don't." The word landed flat and total. "Don't perform family right now." Elliot's hands were still flat on the table. She could see the tendons in them. "You don't know the full situation. There are people involved who— Who are they?" Silence. "Elliot, the people you're protecting with this silence, who are they?" "I can't—" "You can't." Taejun nodded slowly. "Then we're done here." Elliot stood up from the table. The chair scraped. He was vibrating with something, not quite rage yet, but its immediate precursor, the state where a person had exhausted their controlled options and was standing at the border of what came next. His eyes moved to Naomi, and in them she saw it, not hatred, Not exactly, but the particular kind of fury that came from being seen by someone you had treated as invisible for a very long time. You have no idea what you've started, he said to her. Neither do you, she said. He walked out. She heard the front door, she heard the car. She let out a breath she had not known she was holding and put both hands flat on the table the way he had, because her hands needed something solid. Taejun poured water from a pitcher on the counter and set the glass in front of her. He sat down where Elliot had been sitting. He's going to move fast, she said. Yes. The Schaumburg security firm. I have people finding out what he contracted for. I'll know by early afternoon. She drank the water. The kitchen was quiet and morning light was coming through the window now, the particular pale gold of a November morning in Chicago, the kind of light that was beautiful and cold in equal measure. He said there are other people, she said. Yes. He's not running this alone. Taejun's voice was careful. A scheme of this scale requires cooperation at multiple levels. The financial filings, the city approvals, the contractor relationships. Someone in this city's administrative structure has been facilitating. The council liaison, she said, the one who gave me the zoning document by accident. Possibly, or someone above them. He paused. This is why I said 48 hours. We need to know the full map before we move against any part of it, or we signal our position and lose the others. She nodded. She was tired. The kind of tired that came from not sleeping on top of months of low-grade sustained stress. The fatigue of someone who had been carrying weight over a long distance and had stopped being able to pretend the weight wasn't heavy. She put her hands around the water glass. I want to go back to the house, she said. The Evanston house. Elliot's name is on the mortgage, but mine is on the original down payment filing. I want to get certain things before he thinks to send someone. What things? A hard drive. From a home office computer he thinks I never used. She paused. He bought it for the house network, never set up a password. I've had access to his synced files for 2 years. Taejun looked at her for a long moment. 2 years, he said. I wasn't planning to use it, she said. I was trying to understand what was happening with our finances. We kept having liquidity conversations that didn't make sense given what I knew our income looked like. I found the sync by accident. She met his eyes. I accessed it 4 times. Enough to know the scale. I didn't copy anything because I was afraid of what copying would mean about what I was deciding to do. He was quiet for a moment. You have been sitting inside a very large amount of information, he said, for a very long time. Yes. Waiting. Not waiting, she said. Deciding. He studied her. And now you've decided. I decided last night when he walked through that door with her, she said. I decided when I put the ring on the table. I was just... She paused, looking for the honest word. I was just catching the rest of me up to the part that already knew. Something passed through Taejun's expression. Not pity, nothing close to pity, but a recognition she could feel from across the table. The recognition of someone who understood what it cost to hold a position for a long time before acting. The house, he said. We'll go this afternoon. Together. You don't need to... I'm aware. He stood and picked up his cup. I need to make calls. Breakfast is in the refrigerator. Help yourself. He left the kitchen. She sat with the pale gold morning light and the quiet house and the water glass cooling in her hands, and she thought about the hard drive in the Evanston house, and about Elliot already in a car somewhere making calls of his own, and about the thing he had said, "You have no idea what you've started." And the part of her that had spent 14 months studying the architecture of his betrayal knew that he was right about one thing. She did not know the full shape of what was starting, but she knew this. He had built a structure designed to make her disappear into the debris when it collapsed. She was not going to disappear. She was going to be the one who decided when it collapsed, and how, and in which direction the debris fell. And at 3:40 that afternoon, when Taejun's driver pulled up outside the Evanston house, and they found the front door already standing open, the lock punched clean out of the frame, and the home office completely stripped, she understood that the 48 hours they'd planned for had just become something considerably shorter, because Elliot hadn't just moved fast. He had moved first. She stood in the doorway and looked at the empty room, not ransacked, not turned over in the chaotic way of someone looking for something they weren't sure existed. This was deliberate, methodical. The desk was bare, The cable still coiled on the floor where the monitor had been unplugged with care. The filing cabinet on the left wall stood open, drawers extended, empty in the specific way of someone who knew exactly what they were looking for and had found it. Even the wireless router was gone, taken from its shelf mount, the bracket left clean on the wall like a missing tooth and an otherwise intact jaw. Tae-jun stood beside her. He did not speak. He moved into the room and crouched beside the desk, examined the floor, stood again. 2 hours ahead of us, he said. Maybe less. He knew what was on the hard drive, she said, which means he knew I had access. Yes. She walked to the window. The Evanston neighborhood was quiet outside. Mid-afternoon, the street with its bare November trees and its parked cars, and its complete indifference to the fact that something important had just been taken from her. I thought I was careful. You were careful enough for 16 months, Tae-jun said. He found out recently. Not long ago. The move is too reactive, too disorganized at the edges. He pointed to the corner near the baseboard. A single manila folder, empty, with her handwriting on the tab. They'd missed it. They were in a hurry. Someone gave him information about what you had, and he moved before he could plan it properly. She looked at the folder, her own handwriting. Financial cross-reference Q3. She had made that folder 14 months ago and filed it in the cabinet and never touched it again because the relevant information had moved onto the drive. Someone told him, she said. Yes. Who knew I had access to that computer? That's the right question, he said. She turned from the window. Her mind was running the list. Not frantically, not in the scattered way of panic, but with the cold, methodical movement of someone who had been keeping mental lists for a very long time, who had been in this house, who had seen her at the computer, who had any reason to watch her closely enough to notice. One name arrived before the others. Marcus Webb, she said. Tae-jun looked at her. Elliot's attorney, she said. He's been in this house a dozen times. He handles Elliot's personal legal work and his corporate filings. If Elliot's operation has the shape I think it does, Webb knows the full structure. She paused. He was at the anniversary dinner last night. He watched me walk across the ballroom. He was on his phone within 2 minutes of us leaving. Tae-jun absorbed this. Webb has ties to the alderman's office on the north side. He was brought up in a federal corruption inquiry 4 years ago. Nothing came of it. Because whoever was running the inquiry ran out of cooperation from the witnesses, she said. Yes. She looked at the empty desk, at the coiled cable on the floor, at the clean bracket on the wall where the router had been mounted. The hard drive was gone. 14 months of synced files, gone, but she had photographed the 31 pages this morning. Those were on her phone and backed to a cloud account she had opened under a name that was not her name and not her maiden name, and that she had never accessed from a device connected to any network Elliot had ever touched. She had done that 11 months ago, in a public library on the south side, on a Tuesday afternoon wearing a coat she didn't usually wear, because by that point she had understood at some instinctive level that she was building something she needed to be able to survive the destruction of its physical form. The drive was gone. The 31 pages were not. But right now, standing in the stripped home office of the house she had partly paid for and mostly maintained, that felt like a thin margin. We need to move, Tae-jun said. If he was here 2 hours ago, he's had time to make his next call. She followed him out. In the car, she sat with her hands in her lap and looked at nothing and let herself feel, for approximately 90 seconds, the full weight of what the empty room meant, the violation of it. The specific coldness of someone going through your things with that level of intent, removing not randomly but precisely, taking the things that would hurt you most to lose. She let herself feel it, and then she filed it, the way she filed everything. Not away, not suppressed, but organized, placed in the part of her that kept score and would produce the accounting at the appropriate moment. Tae-jun was on the phone beside her, speaking Korean in a low, rapid register she couldn't follow. His tone was the same as it always was, controlled, precise, slightly separated from the urgency of what it was communicating, but she had already begun learning him well enough to hear what was underneath the control. He was angry. Quietly, completely, structurally angry, the kind that didn't need to announce itself because it was already deciding things. He ended the call. Webb called a federal contact this morning, he said. A deputy assistant U.S. attorney. Name is Garrison. They have a history. Webb steered 2 informants toward Garrison's office during the 2021 inquiry. She processed this. He's offering them something. He's offering them me. Taejun's voice was flat. He's positioning Elliot as a cooperative witness in a Kang organization investigation, using the fraudulent partnership amendment as the opening document. He paused. If Garrison accepts the offer and moves forward, any evidence you bring comes inside a frame that's already been built. Naomi Brooks, wife of the Kang organization's contact, turning over documents to protect her new husband's interests. She felt the cold of it move through her, the elegance of it, the terrible functional elegance. Everything I have becomes tainted. Everything you have becomes motive, he said. The car moved south on Sheridan Road, the lake appearing and disappearing between the lakefront buildings, gray-green in the November light. She looked at it without seeing it. He planned this before last night, she said. He planned this months ago. The anniversary event was the trigger. The public humiliation was designed to create a narrative. Estranged wife, humiliated, aligns herself with criminal organization, produces documents under duress or coercion. Any jury in the country sees a woman scorned, she said. Yes. She put her hand flat on the car window. The glass was cold. Outside, a cyclist moved past on the lakefront path, hunched against the wind, indifferent to everything in the black car moving beside them. There's something else, Taejun said. She looked at him. Priya Anand. He said the name with the care of someone handling a fact that had more surface area than it appeared to. My people found her this morning. Found her. She didn't go home last night after the anniversary event. He paused. Her apartment shows no sign of a struggle. Her phone has been off since 11:40 p.m. Her car is in the parking structure at the Crystal Monarch. She sat with this. He has her, she said. I believe so. She was on the transaction accounts, Naomi said. She has direct knowledge of the payment structures. If she talks to the right people before Webb gets Garrison moving, she becomes the cooperating witness that preempts his offer. Taejun nodded. Which means she is currently the most important person in this situation. And also, she understood without saying it, the most endangered. She had not liked Priya Anand. She had seen her for perhaps 90 seconds in the Crystal Monarch ballroom and had registered her as the instrument of her public humiliation, which was not fair to Priya, and she knew it was not fair, but fairness and instinct were different categories. And she'd been operating on instinct since approximately 7:34 the previous evening. But the woman was 26 years old, and she was missing because she knew things. And whatever she had done or not understood about the situation she'd been placed in, this was not the outcome she had signed up for. We have to find her, Naomi said. Yes. Do you know where he'd take her? I have 3 possibilities. He looked at her directly. One of them is a warehouse property on the harbor, south side, registered to a logistics subsidiary. It's been inactive for 8 months. Elliot has a key. He managed the property transition when the subsidiary changed operations. She thought about what she knew of Elliot's geography, the places he'd mentioned over the years, the properties that appeared in financial documents she'd seen. The harbor property had come up twice in documents she'd cross-referenced, once as an asset in a shell company filing, once in an insurance record she'd found attached to an email in his synced folders. That's where she is, she said. You can't know that. I know how he thinks, she said. He chose it for the same reason he chose everything else. It's close enough to be convenient and far enough removed from his primary business address to create deniability. He's used it before. There's an insurance record from 15 months ago listing it as a storage site for the Evanston project equipment. Except the Evanston project didn't have equipment staged until 4 months later. He was using it for something else and backdating the documentation. Taejun looked at her with the particular quality of attention she was beginning to recognize as his version of surprise. Not wide-eyed, not reactive, but a slight intensification of his focus, a gathering of his stillness. Tell my driver, he said. She leaned forward and gave the address to the driver. The car changed direction. She sat back. Her heart was moving faster than she wanted it to. She put her hands flat on her thighs and breathed, slow in, slow out, and watched the city reorganize itself around their new direction. Warehouses and overpasses and the industrial South Shore, And then the harbor, gray and cold and enormous. The water moving its slow November movement that looked almost geological from a distance, like something that had never been still and didn't know how to be. The warehouse was on a service road off the harbor access, chain link fencing on two sides. A loading dock at the front that was chained closed. 3 cars in the small lot, 2 she didn't recognize, one that was Elliot's, the silver Mercedes she had seen in their own driveway for 6 years. Taejun made a call. 10 minutes, he said, and she understood that 10 minutes meant people were coming and she should not interpret the two of them being alone here as the operative situation. I'm going in, she said. He turned. No. Not to confront him, to find her. If she's in there and she hears you coming in force, she panics and whatever hold Elliot has over her gets tighter. She doesn't know me as a threat. She looked at him. She knows me as the woman from the ballroom, the wife. I'm the least dangerous-looking person available right now. You're also not trained for Taejun. She said his name, and it was the first time she'd said it without the formality of a title, and it stopped him. The way a new sound stops a person mid-motion. I've been managing Elliot for 10 years. I know every exit he takes when he's cornered. I know when he's bluffing, and I know when he's actually afraid. She paused. Right now he's afraid. And afraid men make noise. Let me go in and let him make noise at me while you come in the back. He held her gaze for a moment that was longer than it needed to be for consideration. Long enough that she understood he was not primarily calculating tactics. He was calculating something else. Something about her. Something about whether what he was seeing was what it appeared to be. Stay visible through the front window, he said. If you move away from the window, I'm coming in regardless of the 10 minutes. She nodded. She got out of the car and crossed the lot and didn't let herself slow down at the door, because slowing down was a form of doubt, and she was not going to doubt right now. She was going to carry herself through this door the way she had carried herself across the ballroom last night, and trust that her body knew what to do when her mind was too occupied to supervise it. The side door was unlocked. She pushed it open and went inside. The warehouse was large and mostly dark, a single bank of overhead lights on at the far end casting a flat industrial yellow over the space. Pallets stacked along the left wall, mostly empty, a few wrapped in plastic sheeting. The smell of cold concrete and salt water and something faint underneath. Machine oil, old and settled into the floor. Her footsteps were quiet. She walked toward the light. She heard Elliot before she saw him. His voice, lower than usual, the particular register of a man who had been talking to someone for a long time and was losing patience with the conversation. Doesn't matter what you think you understood. What matters is what you're going to say. She came around a pallet stack and saw them. Priya was sitting on a folding chair, wrists bound in front of her with what looked like a zip tie. Not tight enough to cut, but tight enough to mean something. She was still in the champagne-colored dress from the night before, now creased and pulled at the shoulder seam. Her hair was loose and her mascara had moved in the particular way of someone who had been crying hours ago and then stopped. She was not crying now. She was looking at Elliot with an expression Naomi recognized. Not fear exactly, but the state-past fear, where fear had been processed and what was left was a cold, calculating determination to get through whatever this was. Elliot stood over her. He had his jacket off, sleeves rolled, the posture of someone who had moved past the performance of authority into something more raw. There was a second man. She didn't know him, mid-40s, standing near the loading dock door with his arms crossed. Not a lawyer. Something else. Elliot heard her. He turned and his face went through the same 3-stage process she had watched in the hallway that morning. Surprise, recalibration, the locking into performed control. But the control didn't hold as well here. There were seams in it. How did you— The insurance document, she said. You backdated it by 4 months. You should have made it 6. She stopped 10 feet from him. Let her go, Elliot. You don't have any standing to— Elliot. She made her voice the even voice. The voice she had cultivated over 10 years of standing in rooms where things were about to go badly and talking them level. She doesn't know what you think she knows. Whatever you're asking her not to say, she was never going to say it because she doesn't understand the structure clearly enough to explain it. Priya looked at her. There was something in Priya's eyes, a recognition, a rapid recalibration, the look of someone watching a scene and understanding more quickly than expected which way it was running. She signed documents, Elliot said. Her name is on the transaction accounts. If she goes anywhere near a federal, her name on those accounts makes her a victim of financial fraud, not a co-conspirator, Naomi said. She's 26 years old, and she was your girlfriend, and she signed things you told her were routine. Any attorney worth their retainer gets her out of any federal inquiry in 2 conversations. She held his gaze. You don't need her silence. You're scared of her testimony. That's different. He moved toward her. The second man shifted against the wall. You have no idea, Elliot said, and his voice had dropped, had gone to something below the performance level, something she hadn't heard from him in years, or had never heard from him cleanly, had always heard blurred through whatever surface he was running at the time. You have no idea who I've been dealing with. The people behind this, they're not Webb. Webb is a foot soldier. The people at the top of this operation are not people who tolerate— Stop, she said. Exposure of any kind. And if you think walking out of here with a bunch of documents is going to— Elliot, stop! She said it with enough weight that he stopped. She looked at him fully, the way she'd stopped letting herself look at him over the years because full looking required full acknowledgement. Who are you protecting? He closed his mouth. The scheme isn't yours, she said. It arrived as she said it, not a prepared thought, but the completion of a pattern she'd been assembling without knowing she was assembling it. The shell companies, the scale of the money, the sophistication of the liability shield built using Tae-jun's company name. It was too carefully architected for Elliot. He was intelligent, but he was not patient, and this structure required patience. Required someone who could see 5 moves ahead and build the infrastructure for each of them. You're a node, we said, she said. You're not the source. Something in his face broke open, just briefly. The performance went entirely away, and what was underneath it was not the cruelty she'd expected, not the arrogance, but something she hadn't prepared for. Exhaustion. Genuine, deep, structural exhaustion. The exhaustion of someone who had been inside something for too long and had long since passed the point where getting out was an available option. You need to walk away from this, he said, and his voice was different now. Not the boardroom voice, not the ballroom voice, not the voice that had said successful men need a partner who fits the image in front of 200 people. This was the voice from much earlier, from a version of him she had occasionally caught glimpses of in the first 2 years, the version she had made the mistake of loving first. Naomi, I'm serious. You need to take whatever you have and not use it. Walk away. Start over somewhere. Don't make these people feel threatened. So, she looked at him. Who are they? She said. He shook his head. Elliot. I can't. He said it with finality. I cannot tell you that and have you walk out of here. The loading dock door opened. Tae-jun came through it with 2 men she had not seen before, and behind them she registered through the open door, 2 more in the lot. The second man against the wall moved away from it and made a decision with his hands, raising them slightly, that communicated he understood the room had changed. Elliot turned and looked at his uncle. The exhaustion on his face shifted into something else, something that was less complicated than exhaustion, something that had moved past calculation into pure reactive terror, and then past that too, into the particular rigid state of a man who had decided the only move left was forward. His hand moved toward the back of his waistband. Don't, Tae-jun said. Elliot's hand stopped. His chest was rising and falling fast. The sound of it was audible in the warehouse's cold quiet. Then he looked at Naomi, looked at her with something she would spend a long time afterward trying to name, a look that was accusation and acknowledgement, and something more terrible than either, a look that said you should have left this alone, and underneath that, quieter, I should have seen you. And he said to Tae-jun, but looking at her, ask her about the council member. Tae-jun said nothing. Ask her, Elliot said, about Alderman Reyes. Ask her what Reyes told her 18 months ago when she went to him about the zoning approval. Ask her what she agreed to not report in exchange for his cooperation on the Ashford Group's licensing portfolio. His voice was steady now, steadier than anything else he'd said. The steadiness of someone who had saved a specific piece of ammunition for the exact moment when nothing else was working. Ask her what she already knew, and what she decided to sit on, and why. The warehouse was very quiet. She felt everyone's attention arrive on her simultaneously. Tae-jun's, measured and immediate. recalibrating with the speed of someone who had built a life on reading the spaces between what people said. Priya's, sharp and frightened and trying to understand the new geometry of the room. The men at the doors, professionally neutral but present. She stood in the center of it and felt the specific cold of a trap she had walked into without knowing it was a trap. Which was the worst kind, because the ones you walked into knowingly at least had the dignity of a choice. Alderman Carlos Reyes had called her 16 months ago, 3 days after she'd started pulling the thread on the shell company. He had called her personal cell, and he had been warm and careful, and had told her that the Ashford Group's licensing applications had some irregularities that the city's office was prepared to overlook in exchange for certain courtesies, and that he understood she handled most of the Ashford Group's relationship management, and that this was a conversation between professionals who understood how Chicago worked. She had said almost nothing. She had listened. She had told him she would have to think about it. She had never called him back. She had told herself that not calling back was the same as refusing, that silence was a clean exit, that she had not agreed to anything. She had also never reported the call. She stood in the warehouse and understood, with the particular clarity that arrived too late and at full force, that Elliot had known about the call, had possibly arranged it, and had been holding it for exactly this moment, the moment when she was standing in a room with the most powerful person she had ever aligned herself with, and needed that person's complete trust. Tae-jun looked at her. His face was still. His eyes were not. "Naomi," he said. One word. Her name. A question that was also a verdict waiting to hear whether it needed to be delivered. And she understood, standing in the cold of the warehouse with the gray harbor light coming through the high windows, and Elliot watching her with his terrible, exhausted eyes, that she had one choice, and it was not a good choice, but it was the only one she had. She had to tell Tae-jun the truth. All of it, including the part that made her look complicit, including the part that Elliot could use to dismantle everything she had built in the last 18 hours. And she had to do it now, in this room, in front of everyone, before the version of events that Elliot was constructing had another second to set like concrete around her. She opened her mouth. "Reyes called me," she said. She said it into the quiet of the warehouse, and she did not look away from Tae-jun, and she did not soften it or frame it or approach it sideways the way a person approached something they were ashamed of. She came at it directly because the only thing that could save her in this room right now was the truth arriving before Elliot's version of it did. 16 months ago, 3 days after I started pulling the thread on the shell company, he called my personal cell. He was careful about it, warm, professional, the call of a man who had done this before and knew how to keep it from sounding like what it was. She kept her eyes on Tae-jun. His face had not moved. He told me the Ashford Group's licensing applications had irregularities the city was prepared to overlook. He implied that my cooperation in the relationship was expected. I said almost nothing. I told him I would think about it. I never called him back. Tae-jun waited. "I never reported the call," she said. "I told myself that silence was a refusal, that not engaging was the same as refusing." She paused. "It wasn't. I know that. I was protecting the business, the Ashford Group's licensing portfolio, because I thought I could still fix the marriage and I didn't want to start something I couldn't control. That was a mistake." She stopped. Let it sit. Then, "Everything else I've told you is complete. That is the only thing I withheld." The warehouse held the silence. Wind off the harbor pushed at the high windows. The flat yellow light overhead made everything look like evidence. Tae-jun turned his head slowly toward Elliot. Elliot was watching Naomi with the expression of someone whose ammunition had been fired and had not done what ammunition was supposed to do. He recalibrated visibly, the way she'd watched him recalibrate all her life, searching for the next angle, the next surface to push from. "She knew the whole time," Elliot said. "The zoning approvals, the licensing. She was running cover." "I was not running cover," Naomi said. "I didn't report a phone call. That is the full extent of what I did." "Reyes is connected to this directly," Elliot said to Tae-jun. "He's the administrative layer. He processed the approvals that made the Evanston project legitimate on paper. If she had reported that call, the project would have collapsed 16 months ago," Naomi said, "and so would the Ashford Group, and so would the Kang family's adjacent investment structures, and you would have gone down inside a much messier situation than the one that exists right now. She held Elliot's eyes. "I am not going to pretend that protecting the business wasn't part of my calculation. It was. But the thing I was protecting was not you." Something shifted in Elliot's face. The words had landed somewhere real, somewhere past the operational surface of the conversation. Tae-jun walked toward her. Not quickly, not threateningly, but with the deliberate movement of someone closing a distance they had decided needed to be closed. He stopped 3 feet from her. He was close enough that she could see the texture of his tiredness, could see the lines of his face in the warehouse's flat light as something more than controlled presence. As a man who was 61 years old and had been in rooms like this one, rooms with bad light and high stakes and someone asking him to make a decision in real time, more times than any person should have to be. He looked at her for a long moment. She did not look away. "Reyes," he said quietly. "We deal with him after, not now." She nodded. He turned back to the room, to Elliot, to the second man still standing near the wall with his hands in a careful position of non-aggression, to Priya in the folding chair, who had not moved, who was watching everything with the alert, exhausted attention of someone taking mental notes for a reckoning that hadn't arrived yet. "Cut her loose," Tae-jun said to the nearest of his men, gesturing toward Priya. Elliot moved, not toward Priya, toward his jacket, which was hanging over a pallet to his right, and Naomi saw his hand go toward the inside pocket and understood in the half-second before anyone else moved what was in the inside pocket and why he was going for it now, at this specific moment when the room's geometry had shifted and everyone's attention had briefly redistributed. "Elliot," she said. He had the gun out, not pointed at her, not pointed at the men by the door, pointed at Tae-jun, who had turned at the sound of her voice and was now standing at an angle to Elliot, 6 feet between them, nothing in between. The room froze. The freeze lasted approximately 1 second, and in that second, every person in the warehouse performed their own rapid calculation. Threat assessment, exit inventory, the primitive math of a room where the variable of violence had just been introduced. Tae-jun's men moved their hands but did not draw. The man by the wall had gone completely still in the practiced stillness of someone who had learned that stillness was the safest available state in a room with an unstable gun. Elliot's hand was shaking. She could see it from where she stood. Not badly. Not the shaking of someone who had never held a weapon, but the shaking of someone whose adrenaline had exceeded the capacity of their training to suppress it. He had fired a gun before. She knew this, had heard him mention the range, had seen the case in the back of his closet once, and chosen not to ask. But he had never pointed one at a person. She was certain of this, the way you were certain of fundamental things about someone you had lived with for 10 years. "You were supposed to stay out of it," Elliot said to Tae-jun. His voice was tight. "I told you 3 weeks ago. I said, handle it quietly, and I would make sure your structures were clean before anything surfaced." "You told me to distance myself from my family," Tae-jun said. His voice had not changed. Same register, same controlled pace. Standing with a gun 6 feet from his face, and his voice was the same. "That is not something I do." "She is not your family. That is no longer your determination to make." Elliot's jaw worked. His eyes moved to Naomi for a half-second, the fractional look of a man trying to triangulate too many things simultaneously. "You don't know who you're protecting her from. I'm not the problem. I've never been the main problem. You understand? He stopped. The gun hand lowered by 2 degrees, not enough to matter, but the gesture of someone whose internal argument was interfering with their external one. "There are people above me who have been watching this situation since last night. They know she married you. They know what that means. They are not going to allow it." "Who?" Tae-jun said. "I cannot—" "Elliot." His name from Tae-jun's mouth, with a weight she had not heard before. The weight of someone invoking a relationship that had existed before any of this, before the shells and the money and the anniversary gala and the warehouse. The weight of blood. "Tell me who." Elliot looked at his uncle, and for a moment, a terrible, almost unbearable moment, she saw on Elliot's face what had been under all of it, under the cruelty and the calculation and the years of performed confidence. She saw a man who had spent his life trying to be something approximating the figure across from him and had found a shortcut that had turned into a tunnel that had turned into a room with no doors. She saw the result of a choice made years ago by someone who had not understood that some shortcuts erased the road behind them. His arm dropped. The gun pointed at the floor. Chen Wei, he said. He's out of Vancouver. He runs 7 legitimate shipping companies and approximately $40 million in annual revenue through entertainment and property investment. He paused. He's also been the primary capital source for the distribution network I was laundering through. The shells were his structure. I inherited them when I took over the Evanston contracts from his previous contact. He looked at his own hand, at the gun in it, and seemed briefly surprised to find it there. He doesn't know yet that the documents exist. When he finds out, he'll move against everyone connected to the exposure, Taejun said. Yes. The room reassembled itself around this new fact. She could feel it, the way a room's weight redistributed when the fundamental variable changed. This was no longer about Elliot. Elliot was architecture. Chen Wei was the load-bearing structure underneath it. One of Taejun's men said something in Korean. Taejun responded without taking his eyes off Elliot. The man moved toward the loading dock door and stepped outside, phone to his ear. Priya made a sound. Not a word. A short, involuntary sound that came from somewhere past language. The sound of someone who had been holding their breath for too long. She was looking at Elliot. You told me it was import logistics, she said. Her voice was flat, stripped of everything except the fact of what she was saying. You told me the accounts were for import documentation. I signed things because you told me they were documentation. Elliot didn't look at her. Look at me, she said. He didn't. Elliot. Her voice cracked, not emotionally, but structurally, the crack of something that had been held too rigid for too long. I have been sitting in this chair for 6 hours because of something you told me was paperwork. The second man, Elliot's man, still by the wall, chose this moment to speak for the first time. We should move, he said to Elliot. If Chen's people are already watching, this location is... Sit down, one of Taejun's men said to him. He sat down. Taejun walked to Elliot and held out his hand. A single gesture. Unhurried, uncomplicated. The gesture of someone who expected to be obeyed not because of the threat, but because of the relationship, because of everything that had preceded this moment by 30 years and made this moment possible. Elliot looked at his uncle's hand. He looked at it for a long time. Then he placed the gun in it. Taejun handed the weapon to the man behind him without looking. He put his hand on Elliot's shoulder, briefly, firmly, the grip of someone acknowledging a fact rather than offering comfort. And then he released it and stepped back. You're going to tell me everything about Chen's operation, he said. Tonight. Every name, every account, every point of contact you have. And then we're going to determine whether there's anything left to salvage. He paused. Not for you, for the people connected to this organization who are not responsible for what you built. Elliot nodded. He looked like a man whose bones had been removed. Naomi moved to Priya, crouched in front of the chair, looked at her. Up close, Priya was younger than she had registered at the ballroom. Not just in years, but in something less measurable, the quality of someone encountering the full weight of consequences for the first time. Her wrists were red where the zip tie had been. There were cuts. Can you stand? Naomi said. Yes. Priya stood. He was unsteady for a moment. A hand on Naomi's arm, brief, reflexive, then withdrawn, the instinct of someone who needed support and wasn't sure they were allowed to take it from this particular source. I'm sorry, she said. For last night, I didn't... She stopped. We're not doing that right now, Naomi said. Right now we're getting you out of here. She moved Priya toward the side door. Outside, the harbor air hit them both in cold and raw and smelling of lake water and diesel and November, the air of a city that was enormous and indifferent, and had been running its machinery long before either of them arrived in it, and would run it long after. She walked Priya to Taejun's car, got her into the back seat, gave her her own coat because Priya was shaking and the champagne dress had never been designed for a Chicago November morning that had extended through circumstances into a Chicago November afternoon. Then she stood beside the car and looked back at the warehouse and breathed, in and out. The slow, deliberate breathing of someone taking inventory of themselves after something that had demanded everything. She was intact. She was standing. The 31 pages were on her phone in a cloud account that didn't have her name on it. Priya was in the car with her coat. Taejun was inside with Elliot, and Elliot had named Chen Wei, and that name was now in a room with the most formidable man Naomi had ever encountered, and that changed the shape of everything. But Chen Wei didn't know yet what was in that room. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She looked at it, looked at the warehouse, answered. Silence on the line for 2 seconds. Then a voice. Male, accented, the particular precision of someone who had learned English from multiple sources and synthesized them into something that belonged to no single place. Mrs. Kang, it said, I understand congratulations are in order. Her blood went cold. I don't know who, you do, the voice said. You're standing outside a warehouse on the harbor, and you're holding a phone, and you're deciding right now whether to go back inside and tell your husband about this call, or whether to hear what I have to say first. A pause. I'd suggest hearing what I have to say first. She did not move. She made herself stand completely still and breathe and not let her hand tighten on the phone because a tightened grip was a form of reaction and she needed to not react. What do you want? She said. The documents, Chen said. All of them. The photographs, the originals, the cloud backup you created in a library on the South Side 14 months ago under the name Carol Ann Mercer. He paused. And I want your husband's assurance that his organization steps back from any inquiry into Ashford Group operations. In exchange, what happened tonight stays between professionals. Everyone goes home. No escalation. She registered that he knew about Carol Ann Mercer, the library, the cloud account. Her heart was doing something that required management, a rapid, thick drumming she could feel in her throat. She managed it. You're asking me to give you the thing that keeps me alive, she said. I'm asking you to make a practical decision, Chen said. You've been married to Kong Tai-jun for approximately 18 hours. You're a woman who has been operating on intuition and documentation and a very long patience. Those are admirable qualities. His tone was not cruel. It was something worse than cruel. It was respectful in the way a professional was respectful of a job done well before dismantling it. But you're not equipped for what comes next. Give me the documents. Take your life. Start somewhere that isn't this. She looked at the warehouse door. I need time to discuss this with my husband, she said. You have until tomorrow morning, Chen said. 7 a.m. After that, I stop making calls and I start making other arrangements. He paused. Mrs. Kang, I know what you're considering. I know you're thinking about whether Tae-jun's resources are sufficient to— Good night, she said. She ended the call. She stood in the harbor cold for exactly 4 seconds. Then she went back into the warehouse. Tae-jun looked up when she entered. He read her face in the way he read everything. Instantly, completely, without asking the preliminary questions that would waste time they didn't have. Chen, he said. He knows about the cloud backup, she said. The library. The account name. He has full visibility into my documentation structure. She stopped in front of him. He wants everything by 7 a.m. tomorrow, or he moves to other arrangements. The warehouse was very quiet. Elliot, sitting now on a pallet with his hands on his knees, looked up. I didn't tell him, he said. I swear to you, I didn't. Then he had you surveilled, Tae-jun said to Naomi. For some time. Long enough to know about a library visit 14 months ago, she said. Tae-jun turned from her, walked to the small, dirty window that overlooked the lot and the harbor beyond it, and stood with his back to the room. She watched his shoulders, the particular set of them. She was learning him in real time, learning to read the language of how he held himself when he was processing something at full depth. He stood at the window for 30 seconds. 30 seconds in that room felt geological. Then he turned. Call a meeting, he said to his men. Tonight, the full council, every senior partner, every investment head, every family organization representative in Chicago. He looked at the men by the door. I need everyone in one room before 7 a.m. She understood what he was doing. She understood the scale of what he was doing, assembling the full weight of everything the Kang organization was, everything it had been over 30 years, and bringing it to bear before the morning deadline expired. It was not a defensive move. It was the move of someone who had decided that the appropriate response to a threat was not to negotiate the terms of the threat, but to change the nature of the situation so thoroughly that the threat was operating on outdated information. Chen Wei had called her and told her to give him the documents or he would make arrangements. He had made that call without knowing that in approximately 6 hours, Every significant power structure connected to the Kang family's 30-year history in Chicago was going to be in a single room, briefed on the full shape of his operation, with 31 pages of documentation and the testimony of 2 witnesses and the recorded cooperation of a man who had been his primary Chicago contact, and that Naomi was going to be the one presenting the case. "I need a phone," she said to Tae-jun. "A clean one, and I need 3 hours and a printer." He looked at her. "I'm going to organize everything we have into a presentation," she said. "Not for the council, for the federal contact, the one Webb didn't get to yet. The deputy U.S. attorney who isn't Garrison, who isn't connected to Reyes's network, who has been building a case on Chen Wei's Vancouver operation for 18 months and has been running into dead ends because the Chicago layer has been invisible." Tae-jun was very still. "How do you know about that investigation?" "Because the council liaison who handed me the zoning document also handed me, by accident, a correspondence copy from a federal coordination request that referenced a joint task force inquiry into Pacific Rim financial networks." She held his gaze. "I've been sitting on a very large amount of information for a very long time. You said that to me this morning." He said nothing for a moment. Then, 3 hours, he said. He reached into his jacket and produced a phone, clean in its packaging. "Use this." She took it. She walked to the corner of the warehouse with the best light, and she sat on a pallet, and she opened the packaging, and she began to work. And outside the warehouse, through the harbor-facing wall, she could hear the sound of the lake, enormous, cold, continuous, indifferent, running its dark November current against the city's edge. And somewhere in the city, she knew, Chen Wei was sitting with the satisfaction of a man who had made the call he needed to make and was waiting for morning. And he did not yet know that the woman he had called was not the person he had assessed her to be, because nobody in this story had ever correctly assessed what she was. And that had been, from the very beginning, the only advantage she had ever needed. At 4:17 in the morning, Tae-jun's estate on the North Shore came into view through the car window. A property she had not seen before, set back from the road behind mature trees, lit from within, 3 vehicles already in the circular drive, and more arriving as they pulled in. She counted shapes moving through the lit windows. 8, 12, more. He had called the full council. They were all here. She stepped out of the car with a document envelope under her arm and the clean phone in her coat pocket, and 31 pages of organized, cross-referenced, federally actionable financial documentation that she had spent 3 hours converting from raw evidence into something a prosecutor could walk into a courtroom with. The front door opened before they reached it. A man she didn't know held it. Beyond him, a hallway, and beyond the hallway, the sound of voices. Male voices. The low convergent sound of powerful men in a room together. The sound of an organization that had been running for 30 years being called to account for what one branch of it had done. Tae-jun paused at the door, looked at her. "Are you ready?" She thought about the ring on the table, about the empty office in Evanston, about Carol Ann Mercer sitting in a South Side library 14 months ago with a phone and a terrible feeling and nowhere yet to take it. "I've been ready for 16 months, she said. She walked through the door. From somewhere in the house, she heard a door open. Not the front, a side entrance, the kind that suggested arrival by someone who had not come through the main approach. She heard footsteps that were not the footsteps of anyone she'd traveled here with. She heard one of Tae-jun's men say a single word in Korean, sharp and short. The word that meant something had arrived that was not expected. And she turned, and at the end of the hallway, flanked by 2 men she had never seen, his coat still on, his face carrying the particular controlled fury of someone who had received information mid-transit and rerouted accordingly, stood a figure that made every person in the hallway stop moving simultaneously. Chen Wei looked at Naomi across the length of the hallway. He had not waited until morning. Nobody moved. That was the first thing. The hallway held its collective stillness the way a wire held tension. Not absence of force, but the presence of too much force with nowhere yet to go. Chen Wei stood at the far end with his 2 men and his coat, and his face that communicated he had arrived here knowing exactly where here was and why. And Naomi stood at the near end with her document envelope and her clean phone and the 31 pages. And between them was approximately 40 feet of hardwood floor and the accumulated weight of everything the last 36 hours had produced. He was smaller than his voice had suggested on the phone. That was the first thing she registered. Not small, average height, compact through the shoulders, the build of someone who had spent decades at desks and tables rather than any place that tested the body. 60, maybe. Silver at the temples. A quality suit that had traveled well. The face of a man who had made decisions for so long that the capacity to be troubled by them had atrophied into something vestigial. He looked at Naomi with the measured appraisal of someone recalibrating a prior assessment in real time. He had thought he understood what she was. She could see him revising. "You move faster than I expected," he said. His voice was the same as on the phone, precise, placeless. The voice of someone who had learned to communicate for effect rather than expression. "You move faster than I expected," she said. "We're even." One of Taejun's men shifted at the edge of her vision. She felt rather than saw Taejun beside her, his presence, the quality of his stillness, which was a different stillness than the room's stillness, more chosen, more deliberate. The stillness of someone who had decided already what the next thing was and was simply waiting for the geometry to clear enough to do it. From the room beyond the hallway, the voices had stopped. The council knew something had changed. Chenwei took 3 steps into the hallway. Not aggressive, measured, the movement of someone who understood space as language. "I made you a reasonable offer," he said, more to the room than to her, the mode of a man who preferred his audience wider than one. "I gave you until morning." "You gave me until morning to disappear," Naomi said. "That's not an offer. That's a countdown." "Semantics." "Not from where I was standing." He looked at Taejun. The 2 men performed the brief, unspoken assessment that men of equivalent operational weight performed when they encountered each other in contested space. Not dominance display, something more functional than that. The mutual rapid calculation of what the other person actually had and what they were actually willing to do with it. "Taejun," Chen said. The single name, no title, the form of address between people who had known each other long enough that formality was a choice rather than a default. "Wei," Taejun said. "This didn't need to be what it's become." "No," Taejun agreed. "It didn't." Elliot was manageable. The exposure was manageable. The woman, a gesture almost imperceptible toward Naomi, the gesture of someone dismissing a variable, was manageable if she'd taken the exit I offered. "I wasn't interested in your exit," Naomi said. Chen looked at her, not with anger, with the particular quality of attention that came from reassessing a threat level upward. "You understand that what you've built here tonight changes the risk calculation for everyone in this house. Every person in that room," he gestured toward the council room, "becomes exposed the moment those documents enter a federal system. The inquiry doesn't stay contained to Ashford Group. It expands. It follows the money, and the money connects to half the organizations represented here. I know that," she said. "Then you know that they have reason to want this ended quietly as much as I do." "No," she said. "They have reason to want it ended. The quietly part is your requirement, not theirs." Chen was still for a moment. "Explain that." She held the document envelope under her arm, and she looked at him, and she chose her words the way she had chosen everything tonight. Not for performance, not for effect, but for precision, for the specific weight of what she actually meant. "There are 2 ways to end this," she said. "Your way ends it quietly, which means it ends in a way that protects your operation and erases everything I've spent 16 months building. Everyone in that room takes on continued exposure to your network because your network is still running. Every future problem you create becomes their problem because the infrastructure connecting you to them stays intact." She paused. "My way ends it completely. Full federal cooperation, targeted, surgical, Ashford Group, the shell companies, the Evanston Project, Alderman Reyes, and the Vancouver capital structure. It does not touch the Kang organization's legitimate holdings because those holdings are documented separately and the documentation exists to distinguish them from Elliot's operation. Everyone in that room gets ahead of the inquiry by cooperating with it on terms I have already negotiated." She stopped. "Let the silence work. Then, Chenwei's network doesn't survive my way, but everyone else does, cleanly." Chen looked at her for a long time. "You've already made the call," he said. "The call was made at 4:03 this morning," she said. Deputy U.S. Attorney Sandra Okafor. She's been building a Pacific Rim financial case for 18 months. She got the documentation package at 4:15. She has 31 pages, 2 witness statements, and a full structural map of the Ashford Group's shell operation. She paused. She also has Elliot's cooperation agreement signed at 2:40 a.m. He named you in the statement. Something moved through Chen Wei's face. Not panic. He was not a man who panicked, but the particular quality of a calculation completing and arriving at a number that was worse than anticipated. He stood with it for a moment, the way you stood with an injury in the first second before the pain fully registered. Then his right hand moved, not for a weapon, toward his jacket pocket, for a phone. She understood in the same instant that Tae-jun understood, and Tae-jun moved, not toward Chen, but toward his own man at the hallway's edge, one word in Korean, and the man crossed the hallway in 2 steps and took Chen's wrist before the phone cleared the pocket. Chen's 2 men reacted. One of Tae-jun's men came from the room behind. She heard the door, heard footsteps, and the hallway filled with bodies briefly, a compressed collision of movement and intent. She pressed flat against the wall. Someone moved past her fast. She heard a grunt of effort, heard something strike the floor, heard Chen Wei say something in Mandarin that was short and cold, and that she didn't need to understand to recognize as an instruction. His men stopped. Tae-jun's men had them. It lasted 6 seconds. She had counted without deciding to count, the way the body tracked time when everything around it was moving fast. 6 seconds from the first movement to the end of it, and then the hallway was still again, and Chen Wei was standing with his wrist held and his phone on the floor, and his face wearing the expression she had never expected to see there, the expression of a man who had run out of moves. Tae-jun picked the phone up from the floor, looked at it, did not return it. "Wei," he said. "Come in." He said it the way you said it to someone who had stopped being a threat and had become something else. Not quite a prisoner, not quite a guest, but the thing in between. A problem being managed. He said it without cruelty and without satisfaction, the tone of someone concluding an operational phase. Chen Wei walked into the council room. His men stayed in the hallway. Tae-jun's men stayed with them. Naomi followed. The council room was what she had expected and also not what she had expected. A long table, 12 men arranged around it. Some she recognized from years of Ashford Group events. Others she was cataloging now for the first time. Faces she had read about in due diligence documents and business registration filings, and once in an Interpol-adjacent report that had crossed her desk by accident 7 years ago. The room smelled of coffee and tension and the particular staleness of air that had been shared by people under pressure for several hours. Every face turned when Chen Wei walked in. Then they turned to Naomi. She had walked into rooms like this her whole professional life. Rooms where she was the only woman. Rooms where she was the only black woman. Rooms where she was the person who had set up the room and would be the last to leave it, and whose name would not appear in any of the meeting notes. She knew the quality of attention in those rooms, the way it moved across you like water, testing for purchase, looking for the expected surface to slide off of. This room's attention arrived differently, not because it had decided she was something specific, because it had decided it didn't yet know what she was, and in that uncertainty there was space, and she was going to fill that space before anyone else defined it. She placed the document envelope on the table. "My name is Naomi Brooks Kang," she said. "I have been building a case against the Ashford Group's financial structure for 14 months. 3 hours ago, I delivered that case to the federal prosecutor running the Pacific Rim inquiry that several of you have been aware of as a peripheral concern for the last year and a half." She looked around the table. Let her eyes move slowly, contact by contact. It is no longer peripheral. The question in this room is not whether the inquiry proceeds, it proceeds. The question is whether the organizations represented here are inside it as subjects or outside it as cooperating parties. No one spoke. "I've drafted cooperation frameworks for each of the investment structures with Ashford Group adjacency," she continued. "They're clean. They separate legitimate holdings from the shell operation clearly and completely. Each organization that signs by 9 a.m. tomorrow morning is designated a cooperating entity, which means prosecutorial priority goes to the structures above them, not through them." She paused. Chen Wei's operation in Vancouver is the prosecutorial priority. She looked at Chen Wei. He was sitting now, at the end of the table, and he was looking at her with an expression she would remember for a long time. Not hatred, not defeat, but something more complicated, the expression of someone confronting the full dimensions of a miscalculation. He had looked at her at the anniversary gala, she realized, or had received a report of her from someone who had looked and had seen the wife, had seen the instrument of management and social coordination and invisible labor, had built his entire response strategy around the assumption of what she was and had not once considered what she was not. "You're not a lawyer," he said. "No," she said. "But Okafor is." He looked at the table. Something in him settled. The final settlement of a man who had completed his calculation and found the door closed. "The Vancouver structure has 18 employees who are not connected to the financial operation," he said. Not to her, to the room. "They need to be separated from the inquiry, formally." She looked at him. She had not expected this, had not expected that the first thing out of his mouth would be protection for employees. She filed the complexity of it without letting it show on her face. "That can be arranged," she said, "if you cooperate fully with the asset disclosure." He nodded once, the nod of a man who had been in enough rooms to know when the room was over. She looked at Taejun. He was standing at the wall, had not sat, had not positioned himself at the head of the table, had held the room's edge the way he always held the room's edge. He met her eyes. She could not read everything in the look he gave her, but she could read the primary thing. He had watched her work, and what he had seen had confirmed something, and that confirmation had changed something in the texture of what existed between them, which was still new and unmapped and made of contingency and shared pressure, but was also, undeniably, already something. She looked away before the moment became its own distraction. The next 4 hours were work. Pure, sustained, logistical work. The kind she had always done best. The kind that required holding 12 different threads simultaneously and knowing which to pull and when. She moved around the table with the cooperation frameworks, answering questions, modifying language, bridging between the Council's concerns and the federal structure's requirements as she understood them from her conversation with Okafor. Taejun moved when she needed him to move. He clarified, confirmed, directed his men when physical coordination was required. They worked in parallel without needing to negotiate who did what, the way people worked who had assessed each other's capabilities and found the division of labor without discussion. By 7:20 a.m., 11 of the 12 organizations had signed. The 12th was an older man, Korean, 70s, the representative of a logistics organization out of Incheon, whose Chicago operation had the loosest connection to the Ashford Group structures. He had not spoken during the night. He sat with his hands flat on the table and his face arranged in the expression of someone who was old enough to have been in rooms like this before and had not yet decided whether this particular room deserved his trust. He looked at Naomi. "You are a new wife," he said. His English was careful, deliberate. "One day married." "Yes," she said. "And you did all of this." He gestured at the room, at the envelopes, at Chenwei sitting quietly at the end of the table, at the document record and the cooperation frameworks and the federal alignment and the dismantled operation that had been, 18 hours ago, the threat that was going to swallow everything. "Yes," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "Why?" She thought about how to answer honestly. Not the professional answer. The professional answer was about documentation and federal exposure and organizational survival. He wasn't asking for the professional answer. He was asking for the human one. "Because I spent 10 years being the person who fixed things for someone who didn't see me," she said. "I got tired of fixing things for people who didn't see me. I decided to fix something for myself." She paused. "And for the people in this organization who didn't create this problem but would have lived inside its consequences." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he picked up the pen and signed. Taejun's hand came to rest on her shoulder briefly. So brief it could have been accidental, could have been a passing touch with no weight attached. It was not accidental. She felt the weight of it, acknowledgement, measured and complete, the weight of one person telling another person that they had been seen, doing it quietly, without theater, in a room full of people, because that was the kind of person he was. She covered the moment by gathering the signed frameworks and squaring them against the table. At 8:50 a.m., Sandra Okafor arrived with two federal agents and a paralegal who moved through the room collecting the cooperation frameworks with the efficient care of someone who had been doing this long enough to know that the documents on a table could change in 30 seconds if someone panicked. Okafor was 44, sharp-faced, wearing the expression of a person who had been woken before 5 a.m. and had made their peace with it. She looked at Naomi with an assessment that lasted approximately 2 seconds, and then moved on, which was the closest thing to a compliment she was likely to offer in a room full of people she was in the process of deciding whether to prosecute. "The Vancouver employees," Naomi said quietly to Okafor as she moved past. Okafor nodded. "Already noted. We're not going after support staff." She paused. "You did good work on the structural separation. The Kang legitimate holdings are clean on the documentation. We won't need to go near them." "Thank you." Okafor looked at her once more. "Don't thank me. I've been trying to get through the Chicago layer of this network for 18 months. You handed me a door." She moved on. Chen Wei was taken out through the front entrance at 9:04. He walked between the federal agents without being held, without resistance, with the composed walk of someone who had made his decisions and was now living inside them. At the door, he stopped and looked back into the house, and his eyes found Naomi where she stood in the hall. He didn't say anything. She didn't say anything. There was nothing left to say that the night hadn't already said. Then he walked out, and the door closed, and the November morning light came through the side lights and lay across the floor. The room emptied slowly. Council members left in the quiet, purposeful way of people who had places to be and things to implement. Hands were shaken. Not with her. Not at first. Then one man, the Incheon logistics representative, stopped in front of her on his way out. He inclined his head. Brief. Formal. The gesture of someone offering respect in the specific vocabulary of respect they had. She inclined her head in return. Tae-jun walked each departure to the door himself. She watched him from the hallway, the way he moved through the transitions, the brief words exchanged, the quality of attention he gave each person, which was the same regardless of their organizational weight. She was learning him in increments, and each increment revised the picture she was building in a direction she hadn't fully anticipated. He was not what she had expected a man like him to be. She suspected she was not what he had expected her to be either. They were, in this sense, still finding the shape of the thing they were inside. At 10:15, the house was quiet. Priya was in a guest room upstairs. She had been brought here from the warehouse, had slept in the early morning hours while the council meeting ran, had given her statement to Okafor at 9:30 with the methodical, exhausted honesty of someone who understood exactly what the statement was going to cost her, and had decided the cost was less than the alternative. She had cried once, briefly, in the middle of it, and then had stopped and continued. Naomi had sat in the hallway outside the room while the statement was taken. Not inside, not present, but near enough that if something happened, she was available. She didn't analyze why she'd done this. She just did it. Elliot had been taken by federal agents the previous night from the warehouse. She didn't know where he was being processed. She found, sitting now in the quiet kitchen of Tae-jun's North Shore estate, with a cup of coffee that had been sitting long enough to go cold, that she had spent all her available emotion on Elliot somewhere around 3 a.m., and what remained was not grief and not satisfaction, but something closer to the feeling after a fever broke, the bone-deep flatness of a body that had been running hot for a long time and had finally stopped. Tae-jun came into this kitchen. He sat across from her, the same configuration as the morning before in the Gold Coast building, the two of them at a table with the morning light changing the quality of everything. He looked tired. Not depleted. Tired in the specific way of someone who had spent the night operating at full capacity and was now allowing the effort its acknowledgement. He looked at her coffee cup. "That's cold." "I know." He stood, took her cup, emptied it, poured fresh, set it in front of her, sat back down. She wrapped both hands around it. The warmth was immediate and grounding and small, and she needed something small right now, something that was just the uncomplicated fact of warmth against her palms. "Okafor will need you available for the next several weeks," he said. "Depositions. Clarifications on the documentation structure." "I know. The Reyes situation will surface separately. The City Council liaison connection, that's a different inquiry. Possibly state level. You'll need to make a proactive statement about the phone call before it emerges another way." "I know." She looked at him over the cup. I've already drafted it. I wrote it at 4 a.m. before the council meeting. It's on the clean phone. He looked at her. Something in his expression shifted. Not surprise, past the recalibration that surprise required. Something steadier than that. Something that had settled into a recognition that was no longer provisional. You had already done all of it, he said. Most of it. There were things I couldn't do until I had your organization behind me. But the framework was there, like... She paused. It's been there for a long time. I just needed to not be alone inside it anymore. He was quiet for a moment. Outside, the November morning moved, a wind off the lake that reached even here, this far north, this far from the harbor and the warehouse, and the ballroom where the night before last she had placed a ring on a white tablecloth and walked across a room. This marriage, he said carefully, it began as a calculation. Yes, for both of us. Yes. He looked at the table. I want you to know that I was watching you last night in that room with the council, with Okafor. He paused. Not because I was uncertain of you. I stopped being uncertain of you somewhere around 3 a.m. He looked up. I was watching because I have spent 30 years building something, and I have never once in that time had a person beside me in a room who... He stopped, started again. Who was doing what you were doing? Who understood the full shape of the problem and was moving through it at the same speed I was moving through it, in the same direction, without needing to be directed? She held the cup, said nothing. Let him finish. I don't know what this becomes, he said. I'm not going to make claims about it. You've had enough of people making claims about you without delivering anything. He met her eyes. But I want you to know that what you did last night, I saw it, completely, every part of it. She felt the words arrive in her in the way that the simplest true things arrived, without fanfare, without theater, settling into the place they were meant for with the quiet precision of something that had been expected without being predicted. She had not known she needed to hear it until she heard it. She had not known how long she had been going without it until the absence of it ended. Okay, she said. He nodded once. They sat in the morning quiet. Outside, Chicago ran its ceaseless machinery of consequence. The courts and the council chambers and the federal buildings and the offices and the streets and the harbor with its gray November water moving its long, cold current toward the lake's enormous indifferent center. Somewhere in that city, a process had begun that would move for months through depositions and filings and plea agreements and the slow formal architecture of accountability. Elliot's name was in it. Reyes's name was in it. Chenway's name was in it. The shells and the concrete contractor and the fraudulent partnership amendment and the Evanston project that existed on paper and the $42 million that had moved through structures designed to be invisible were all in it now, visible, named, placed in the record. It was not over. It would not be over for a long time. She understood this, understood that what she was sitting in right now was not the end of something, but the beginning of the long, unglamorous work that followed the crisis. The weeks and months of giving statements and reviewing documents and sitting across tables from prosecutors who had questions she'd already answered and would ask again in different configurations to see if the answers stayed the same. She was not afraid of that work. She was built for that work. She had always been built for it, had always had the patience and the precision and the willingness to be in a room after everyone else had left and keep working. She had just been spending those capacities on the wrong things, in service of the wrong version of herself. That was done. She looked at the window, at the bare November trees at the edge of Tai Jun's property, their branches making their complicated dark tracery against the pale gray sky. She looked at them and thought about the ring on the table and the ballroom and the walk across the room that had started all of this. The walk she had taken without knowing where it would end, knowing only that standing still was no longer a thing she could do. She did not regret it. Not the walk, not the ring, not any of it. Not even the 16 months of sitting on information she wasn't ready to use, because those 16 months had built the case, had built the documentation, had built the meticulous structural understanding of the operation that had made last night possible. Everything she had done in the wrong direction had taught her exactly how to move in the right one. She thought about what Elliot had said in the warehouse. You have no idea what you've started. She knew what she'd started. She had started a version of her life where her name was in the record. Not a footnote, not a credit buried in an acknowledgments page, not the background work that kept a man functional while the man's name went on the building. Her name in the record, attached to what she had actually done, visible, real, belonging to her. She thought about the Incheon logistics representative inclining his head, about Okafor saying, "You handed me a door," about Priya's exhausted, complicated eyes in the warehouse light, about Taijun standing at the edge of the council room all night, moving when she needed him to move. "I want to work," she said. Formally, whatever the Kang organization's legitimate structure becomes after this, I want to work inside it, properly, with a title and a defined role and decision-making authority. Taejun looked at her. "I was going to ask you the same thing." "I know," she said. "I wanted to say it first." The ghost of something moved across his face, the structure of the smile that never quite arrived, but whose architecture was becoming familiar to her, whose absence had started to communicate as much as most people's presence. "Executive Director of the Kang Foundation," he said, "the legitimate investment and mediation arm. It handles conflict resolution between business organizations, international partnership facilitation, and humanitarian business partnerships," she said. "I know what it does. I've been reading your organizational filings for 3 years." She paused. "I want final approval authority on all conflict mediation engagements." "Agreed. And I want the team rebuilt from the ground up. New hires, no one connected to Elliot's network." "Agreed. And I want an office with a window that faces the lake." He looked at her for a moment. "That one," he said, "I'll have to check." She finally, genuinely, for the first time in approximately 36 hours, almost smiled. The morning light moved across the kitchen floor as the wind shifted the clouds outside, and the coffee was warm, and the city was running its long, complicated machinery beyond the window, and she sat in the quiet of the aftermath. Not peace, not yet. Not the clean peace of something fully resolved, because the resolution would take months and the work ahead was real and the cost of the last 2 days would be felt in ways she hadn't yet discovered, but something more durable than peace. She sat in the knowledge of her own shape, the knowledge of what she was made of, what she was capable of, what she could endure and what she could build inside the endurance. She had always known these things. She had spent 10 years performing them in service of someone else's name. She was done performing. The thing that Elliot had believed was a humiliation, the walk across the ballroom, the ring on the table, the public exit, the woman who left without crying, had been the most honest thing she had done in a decade. And the man who had laughed as she walked out, certain he had won, was now inside a federal process that would define the rest of his life. She had not planned for him to suffer. She had not walked toward Taijun that night with revenge as the operating motive. She had walked toward Taijun because it was the only direction left that wasn't backward, and backward was the only direction she had committed, at some deep structural level of herself, to never going again. That Elliot's laughter had turned out to be the last free sound he would make for a long time. That was not her revenge. That was consequence. And consequence, unlike revenge, did not require her to carry it. She set down the coffee cup. "I need to sleep," she said. "There's a room on the second floor," Taejun said. "East-facing. It has a view of the trees." She stood. He did not stand with her. He remained at the table, already turning toward whatever the next thing was, already inside the work that would occupy the next months of both their lives. She passed him on her way out of the kitchen, and she stopped, briefly, and put her hand on the back of his shoulder. The same gesture he had made to her in the council room, brief and deliberate, and carrying its full weight precisely because it was not elaborate. And then she continued through the kitchen door and down the hall and up the stairs. The room was east-facing. Through the window, the bare trees and the pale sky and the light that was neither warm nor cold, but present, simply present. The November morning doing what November mornings did regardless of what had happened underneath them. She lay down on top of the covers in her clothes. The same position she had held the night before in the Gold Coast guest room, but different. Different in the way that everything was different when the thing you had been bracing against had finally arrived, and you had moved through it and were still standing. She looked at the ceiling. She was 38 years old. She had 31 pages of documentation, a signed cooperation agreement, a federal prosecutor with her number, a foundation directorship, and a marriage that had begun as a calculation and was becoming something she did not yet have the right word for, which meant she would have to be patient, and patience was the one thing she had always had more of than she needed. She closed her eyes. Outside, the wind moved through the bare trees with the sound that wind made in November, when the leaves were gone and nothing was left to translate it. Raw, unmediated, the sound of the thing itself. She listened to it until she couldn't anymore, until the exhaustion of the last 36 hours came for her completely, and she let it come, let it take her down into the deep, dreamless sleep of someone who had finally, at significant cost, arrived somewhere that was hers.